My main purpose today was to point out a dichotomy that I think underlies much of what we are now seeing, including the loss of people like Sam and Claire from this discussion. What I think they would say about why they've left is that they've been hounded by people. And if you look on Twitter, you will see that the conventional wisdom about what is true with respect to things on which they've both taken very strong positions has shifted radically. And so what I wanted to talk about is, now that we are almost 3 years into the COVID phase of history, I want to talk about what happened with respect to people's intellectual standing and people's intellectual performance. That there's an interesting pattern that I think comes down to a single dichotomy about which we can say a lot of nuanced things, but a single dichotomy that separates those who ended up severely damaging their reputations and those who in the end turned out to be right, in spite of what may have been said about them before. Now, obviously, I believe you and I are in that latter category, where it is increasingly clear that our concerns about the vaccines were, if anything, overcautious, that our skepticism of their utility was well placed, that our belief that there are alternatives that might well have been applied that weren't being used because they weren't profitable seems to be accurate, and our argument that this does not appear to be a natural pandemic, but in fact downstream of a lab leak that is in fact linked to some of the same people who have given us such bad policy with respect to treating and controlling the disease, that also turns out to be well supported by the evidence. So how the heck did we do it, right? And why did so many others fail to, including Sam and Claire? And the point I want to make is that I think there are really two approaches to clear thinking. And it comes down to, that's very cute. What does one attempt, as is now taught in graduate school in effectively every field as far as I can tell, does one attempt to figure out which model is best and then become expert in applying it? Or does one deploy a model and compare its results to the emerging evidence and adjust the model accordingly and move in the direction of better and better models, right? And my claim is going to be that our entire expert class was doing the former thing. It was practiced at a game in which it would identify a model that was claimed to be the best. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but such a model. And then it applied that model. It applied it with great nuance sometimes, but it applied that model and it doubled down on it. And at the point that model turns out to be false, they go down with the ship. And that happened in the space of a very short time span with respect to COVID.
And often shouting about how the ship can't possibly be going down because they were promised, they were assured, they looked into it themselves, the model is right. The model must be right.
And that is the curious thing about this, is if you check in with these people, you do not get what I would ordinarily expect of intellectuals, which is at least grudging acknowledgement that they had taken a position that turned out not to be right. And maybe I would expect amongst the lower quality ones excuse making about how they got suckered by some piece of evidence that mesmerized them when they should have been looking at something else. But instead what you find is a kind of insistence that no, in fact, they were right and they still are. And so that is going to be the red flag. If your position on COVID hasn't changed radically, then your position isn't your position, it's something else, right? It's you deploying a position held by something else. And so anyway, what I'm going to argue, go ahead.
I just want to add in other ways of saying what you're saying whenever it occurs to me. In science, in the kinds of science that we were trained in and and engaged in many rooms under many circumstances and in many forests under many circumstances, we were assured that you don't prove a hypothesis correct. That this was, the falsificationist kind of science, sort of Popperian thinking, in which you can work very, very hard to try to falsify an idea, a hypothesis. And if you fail to do that, if you fail to falsify a cherished or not cherished hypothesis after a lot of hard work, you have greater and greater confidence that it is true, but you don't ever completely know that it is true. And so one of the things that I hear you saying here is, and we talked a couple of weeks ago, and I wrote actually a couple of weeks ago in Natural Selections about the nature of certainty. That, are you comfortable with an idea? Oh, other people who I am supposed to trust or I do trust say that thing is correct, therefore that's it. One hypothesis, one thing, that's it, we're done. Every decision I make is based, the decision tree may go on. There may be forks in the future, but that is unchanging. As opposed to, there's a question, there's an observation, there's a set of things going on. What could explain them? I got hypothesis 1, which partially explains this, but doesn't explain that. I got hypothesis 2, which is counter to that because it explains things differently and they predict different things. I've got hypothesis 3, and especially with something as complex as COVID, the landscape of the last 3 years, you don't just have one set of mutually exclusive hypotheses. There's the question of lab leak, there's the question of vaccine safety, the question of vaccine efficacy, of off-label treatments of all of the various sorts that we have, and whether or not they're safe, whether or not they're effective as prophylaxis, as treatment. So lots and lots of different questions. But for all of them, are you keeping multiple possibilities alive in your mind at once, or have you concluded, you know what, this is it? Nope, I will not ever conclude that. If it's called a vaccine, it could possibly be anything but safe and effective, for instance.
I think that's very well said, and I would just add to it that one thing that is true is that corrupt science will inherently be verificationist. Right? That falsificationism is incompatible. It's almost impossible to do it well. Right? You might pretend to be a falsificationist, but if you look under the hood, you will find verificationism where science has been corrupted. Yeah. But let me just describe the two models, and you will see, I think, why one of them failed so badly with COVID. It always fails, but it failed so badly with COVID.
Great.
The two models are, you pick your model of the universe or a particular subset of the universe, some discipline, how does X thing work? And you apply it as an expert, but you don't question it, right? And the other is you start somewhere and you start working towards a better and better model by adjusting, right? Now, my claim is going to be, I don't actually care where you start. It is better to start closer to the target. Any process in which you actually adjust with response to evidence will eventually take you where you are going, and it will very rapidly surpass the static application of anything but an already excellent model.
Someone employing a self-correcting process who is farther from the truth is someone you would prefer to follow in their thinking, in their conclusions, than someone who is currently closer to the truth of that matter, but is employing a static model.
Right. Now, there is a degree of difference in that if you have a very mature understanding of some set of facts, then the model that somebody adopts wholesale may be pretty good to start with. And so their failure to adjust may not be a big handicap, right? Yeah. But what did we get with COVID? We got a situation where nobody knew anything, right? There were no good models. So the fact that X person's model was 3 times as good as Y person's model had almost nothing to say about whether it ended up better. The question was, are you adjusting your model and improving it, or are you keeping your model static and just applying it? And so what I'm going to claim is that all of the people who failed so spectacularly have not substantially changed their opinions. Now, there will be little cases pointed out where people made little adjustments. By and large, the people who say that the vaccines are safe and effective have not changed their tune. They, in fact, started with that as an assumption, and they now report it as a conclusion. And that this is actually evident, it just so happens that I tangled with both Claire and Sam over this issue before there was COVID. Mm-hmm. I tangled with them about the question of whether or not vaccines are inherently safe. And my point is, I'm still a big believer in this technology. I still think it's one of the most marvelous success stories of
traditional vaccine
medicine.
technology.
Vaccine technology in principle. However, if vaccines are safe, it is because of a system that prunes the dangerous ones before they get to the public. And we know of multiple failures where vaccines that were not safe got to the public. And we know of many other failures where vaccines didn't get to the public but failed in the testing phase. And what that tells you, if vaccines are sometimes not safe, which we discover in testing, and sometimes not safe, which we discover after they've been released to the public, there's nothing inherently safe about this technology, right? So if vaccines are safe, it can only be because of an excellent system that spots the ones that aren't and keeps them away from you. I know we don't have an excellent system, therefore not safe, right? I'm not saying any individual vaccine is harmful, but I'm saying the idea that they are inherently safe is dead on arrival. And so if you adopted that, especially if you had it prior to COVID and then something was pointed at you and they said, here is a vaccine, safe and effective, and of course it's safe and effective. They all are. No, that's wrong. You've already demonstrated that applying your model is going to leave you in the gutter, right?
And it also... You were still going.
No, go ahead.
It also betrays, I think, the hesitation that we saw early in COVID. If you can, remember the spring of 2020. And what we were seeing, at that point, we were just beginning our live streams, and it was, there was a lot of terror, there was confusion, all of this, but overwhelmingly, one of my senses was exhilaration with regard to the scientific literature, because the scientific literature was open. There were so many people at that point who, as far as I know, almost no one in the very early days was being shut down yet. Very quickly that started to happen, but the preprint servers were just full of papers, and there was so much going on, there was so much research being done, that the voices of authority that decide for you which ones are good and which ones aren't weren't doing the work, right? These hadn't even made it to journals yet, so the peer review process, which is ridiculously broken, wasn't in the way. The editors weren't in the way. The journalists weren't in the way. What you had, if you had if you had the wherewithal and the interest, as we did, to actually wade into the scientific literature as it was being generated day by day in the spring of 2020, it's like, oh my God, there's so much here. And yeah, we can't possibly assess all of it, but how much preferable it is for us, and it should be for anyone, as time-consuming as it is, to go to the source and say, does this make sense? Is this research good? As opposed to, well, I don't have time for that. I'm going to trust this guy who no one had ever heard of before, who happens to run an organization that's under the NIH, who says, nope, not that, this, that, and oh, in Fauci we trust. Like, that quickly became the thing that people did because they were scared, they were confused, they didn't know, they wanted someone to look at. And that guy had a conclusion. A few conclusions that we now can be pretty sure almost all of them were not helpful for humanity. And what we were doing, and what many people were doing, but mostly not people who were on your screens, were saying, we don't know, we think this, let's see what is being learned. And that ability to actually look at the scientific literature quickly got polluted. Of course.
Well, it did get polluted. It got captured because, frankly, people were paying attention to what we and others were making of this emerging literature, and it got in the way of whatever. I still don't have any idea what the actual plan of those who enforced their narrative on us was. But
Yeah.
the point is, that whatever that force was that was enforcing its narrative, whatever its motivation was, it very quickly figured out that it couldn't very well have us discussing the pre-peer-reviewed literature with the public. Oh my goodness, right? That's too dangerous.